Hi folks, and welcome to Realpolitik, a podcast where we gather to respond to pressing issues in global affairs by prescribing realistic foreign policy solutions for the governments of Canada and the United States. In today's episode, I'll have the pleasure of having on preparedness expert Jeff Donaldson to discuss emergency preparedness in Canada and what went wrong and what we did right in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and other public emergencies. Jeff is a preparedness scholar currently pursuing a PhD in public policy at the School of Public Policy Administration at Carleton University, specializing in emergency preparedness and policy implementation failures. Jeff is also the CEO and principal researcher at Preparedness Labs Inc. He is a former major for the Canadian Army, helping alleviate public crises, emergencies, and disasters for 28 years. I also recommend checking out his podcast, Inside My Canoehead, where he discusses emergency preparedness. Here's our discussion on the topic. So just to start us off with some definitions, could you define what emergency preparedness is, disaster management, and any kind of definition that you would like to define?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. So the easiest thing to understand is that disaster and emergency management as a large-scale field kind of emerged out of Cold War ideology. And we can go into a lot more discussions about that later, but the idea behind it is it's emerged as a separate and distinct field. And when you talk about disaster and emergency management, it's subdivided into what we call 4 pillars or 4 stages or 4 areas of research, depending on your lens and your framework for which you're looking at it. The first one would be your mitigation, and that's your efforts that you undertake long-term to look at major projects, usually infrastructure related, to reduce the possibility of effects harming your society. And a great example of that is if we think about the almost annual floods of the Red River Valley in Winnipeg. And many, many decades ago, they decided to build this massive floodway that is hundreds of millions of dollar investment. That was a mitigation effort that basically sent all of the water away from the city of Winnipeg in these major floods. However, it did happen to flood a whole bunch of smaller towns, but that was the trade-off decision at the time, is that we'll flood the smaller towns and a lot of farmers' fields in lieu of flooding the major city of Winnipeg. So the first part of disaster emergency management are those mitigations, the big muscle movements, generally by governments, that we do to try to mitigate the effects of a disaster or an emergency. The second one is preparedness, and that's considered all the effects taken in advance of a hazard occurring that enables adequate immediate response to the effects of an event, designed to eliminate the need for those last-minute public interventions and to contribute to a better recovery outcomes. So those can be looked at through a lens of talking about individual humans as the preparedness that they take. And you can look all the way up to the strategic level to governments and the emergency preparedness that they would undertake for government perspective. So it's all the things that they do to just get ready for when a disaster happens, that they have the capacity to deal with the immediacy of the event and the immediate effects of the event. So those two are things that kind of happen before events. So we have a before and after game here in emergency management. So that's the before game. So the after game contains, the first part of it is response. And that's the sexy stuff. That's your lights, your sirens, your first responders, your news hits on CNN. For international disasters, those are your flights of aid that go into the foreign airports and you see the world coming to help. And the response phase is everything that is done to deal with those immediate effects of the disaster. So it's all about life-saving property, minimizing the damage to property and individuals. So it's all that immediate stuff that you see on TV that's really exciting. And that's the majority of the focus in the emergency management world. Everybody's interested in being part of the big sexy stuff with all the lights and sirens. And then the last part, which is arguably the least understood part of emergency management, and that is the recovery phase. And it's usually the longest. So this is the build back, as we traditionally refer to it. So a community has suffered some event. The response phase is over. The lights and sirens have gone away. CNN and all the companies have moved on to the next event. And now the society has to build back. So these are all the things from housing to a citywide infrastructure, to individual jobs, to relocation of people, to short-term and long-term housing, and all those complicated governance issues that can take years, if not decades. They're still building back in parts of Indonesia from the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami that killed, 250,000 people. These things take a lot of time, and it's actually the least understood and least well-researched part of disaster and emergency management is that recovery phase. So if you think of everything fits into one of those 4 phases, pre or post, but 2 really important definitions is disaster and emergency. So a lot of people use these interchangeably, which in normal conversation they are, but when you look at the professional side of disaster emergency management and you look at the academic research side, they're 2 distinct definitions. So an emergency would be something for you and I, or a city or a country, that causes a disruption to your normal day, your normal way of life, but it is within your own capacity and resources to manage. So the tornadoes that went through Dunrobin here just outside of Ottawa, where I live, were an emergency for the city, which means the city had the resources to deal with it. It caused, all kinds of plans to be shelved, states of emergency to be put into place, etc. But the city was able to deal with it. So it was an emergency. A disaster is when an individual or an organization or a governance level has to ask for external help. So when the city has to go to the province for help, it becomes a disaster for the city and it becomes an emergency for the province. And it's a scalar thing. So when we have an emergency in or a disaster in the province of Ontario, and they call in the federal government of Canada to normally provide some military assistance to wildfires or whatever it may be, that is an emergency for the government of Canada and a disaster for the province. So the disaster nomenclature comes into play when you need to ask for external resources. So I think those are there's a bit of nuance, clear differentiation between those 2 that I think is important.
For sure. And you touched on it a bit there. What does emergency preparedness and management mean for Canada in particular? What kind of emergencies do we have to deal with on a yearly or regular basis?
So, fortunately and unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, all 3 levels of government in Canada have a role to play in emergency management, and it's all different. So what you have to look at, your view depends on where you are, at what stage you are. So within the genre, what the professionals do is something called a HIRA, a Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. So this is the standard nomenclature for in the emergency management world, and it looks at your area of responsibility. So if I'm a municipal emergency manager, I'm doing a HIRA for my city. If I'm a provincial emergency management officer, I'm looking at the region of my province or the province as a whole to look at what my hazards and the risk profile for those hazards are. And then again, you can scale that out to the national HIRA, which looks at everything that could happen within the country of Canada. So a hazard is probably another good definition. That is an unrealized potential event. So right here in Ottawa, I live on a fault, on a seismic area. Now we rarely get a few shakes. We had a pretty good shake in 2009 when I was living here. It almost knocked me off my desk at work. But we live in a seismic area. So the earthquake potential is called a hazard. So when we say in emergency management, it's a realized hazard, that means we're having an earthquake. That's where the hazard identification is. So you look at what are all the possible human and natural cause things that could happen in your area. That's your hazard identification. And then as a risk assessment, you're looking at because we know that risk definition of risk is, severity times potential. So you look at then what the possible outcomes is. So in Canada, from a strategic perspective, you're looking at significant hazards sitting on the Cascadia earthquake potential on the southwestern coast of BC. Depending on who you talk to, there's a 1 in 50 chance of a 7 magnitude or higher. And experts are not all over the map. They're certain that it's coming. We just obviously don't know when. So from the government of Canada, you have a massive hazard sitting on the west coast. The east coast, where I grew up, is, every 2 to 3 years is going to get walloped by some kind of hurricane, post-tropical depression, tropical storm, something along that lines. You have flooding in different areas of the country. Like we have periodic flooding in the Ottawa Valley. There's flooding in the St. John Valley. So each individual province has its own hazard and risk assessment that they do. So we face a whole bunch of them. But that's just natural. We also have the man-made ones. We have industrial risks. So, if you're old enough to remember the explosion in Bhopal, India, that happened several decades ago that killed tens of thousands of people, mainly because of, some chemical plant blew up and basically poisoned the population. So it's not just, everybody thinks it's just natural. There's a lot of man-made disasters. Lac Megantic is a perfect example. That is a huge hazard, having rail lines to go through the middle of a city that carry toxic and explosive chemicals and products. And unfortunately, in Lac Megantic, we saw what happens when that hazard is realized. So it's not just the big thing and traditional things that people think of. It's right across the spectrum.
And do people usually think of pandemics as part of that, even though they only occur about once a century or so?
Within the individual thought process, no. I would argue that no Canadian, writ large in general, was walking around thinking, I wonder what my personal preparedness level is for the coming pandemic in early 2019. And rightfully so. Like you said, it's a 1 in 100 possibility. There is literally nobody alive to tell us stories from the last major one. And so it's so far removed. And considering what is going on in today's socioeconomic and political environment, it's very difficult for something like a pandemic to come up on the radar when it's not. And we saw that with the federal government making decisions about funding for pandemic response and things leading up to it. But from an individual, no. I mean, it just, even as a government, I mean, emergency management always has that difficult side, is that we are the individual in the corner waving our hands, telling everybody to panic and get ready for something that quite possibly may never happen. And we're competing for resources in a government against every other government program. And I'm asking you to give me money from the limited taxpayer funds to prepare for something that may never happen, that I'm not even certain what the outcome will be. But trust me, it's going to be bad. And so it's very difficult to win that argument across the way. So no, unfortunately, pandemics, and as a side joke, I found that my research into pandemic preparedness and emergency preparedness in Canada didn't really raise a single eyebrow at my university in 2017, in 2018, and for the most of 2019. And then all of a sudden in 2020, in my fourth year of my PhD, everybody seems to want to talk to me about emergency preparedness and the theory of it, because all of a sudden it's relevant, right?
And I guess that goes to my next question, which is, with such low probabilities to deal with and people seeing those low probabilities, how do you usually explain to people why they should care about these issues and why you think they're important?
I think because we try to keep preparedness at a general level. If I try to tell people to prepare for something that has an exceptionally difficult outcome and is exceptionally difficult to do, it goes up a bit against an individual's barrier to prepare. And one of the things that we see in research, that people are not becoming prepared because when thing is so catastrophically bad, like if I try to tell people you need to prepare for a potential nuclear attack on your city, most people are going to dismiss me first of all. And those that are going to pay attention, when they realize the level of effort required to get ready for that, they're just going to forget it. You know what? I'm just going to burn. I'm not going to worry about it. So the same thing when you talk about something specific as a pandemic, it is difficult to tell people to make sure that they're staying 6 feet away from people to limit airborne contagion when there's no airborne contagion identified, right? We just can see these commercials out there like, stay 6 feet apart, do what we need to do so we can go back to this behavior before, all out in clubs and restaurants and patios and having a great time, and all the people at the sports venues and things like that. We kind of stay away from persuading people to be prepared for a single event. Preparedness is more about a mindset. And this is what I talk about in both my research and on my own podcast, is that it's very much about a lens and a theoretical framework on life. So when we talk preparedness, what we should be talking to people about is thinking about preparedness in all aspects of your life. So preparedness for your finances, preparedness for your transportation, preparedness for your future. A lot of people, RSP and the TFSA is a preparedness measure for your future. It's providing a layer of insulation and giving you a little bit of resilience against disruptions that may occur in the future. And that's what preparedness does. It wraps an individual or an organization or a country in this layer of insulation of safety that gives you a little bit of a buffer zone that allows you to deal with those immediacy events of something happening without long-term disruptions happening.
And in the context of the pandemic, have you found that you've had more success getting through to people and making them care about emergency preparedness issues and just getting ready for whatever may come their way?
Well, exactly, and it has worked, because the phraseology that I've used is, do you remember March? Do you remember how scary March was, how disruptive March was? Like, nobody knew what was going on. The information was conjectural at best. We actually did do significant changes to our lives. You could play floor hockey or ball hockey outside on a freeway and you wouldn't have had to yell car and move your nets because there was nobody out. Nobody was out and about. We had, that's what I use. I mean, you just go back and think about what happened in March, and then you think about what about the next March? And this is the phrase that we try to use, is that March is a great example, and it serves as a great conversation piece to open that discussion about preparedness. Look what happened in March. Look how disrupted and out of control you felt when this happened to your life. How about we don't let that happen again? How about we undertake the things within your whole life, like I said, finances, transportation, everything about your life, and build this wall of resilience around yourself to be able to move forward. And so that when the next disruption happens, because the pandemic is very topical, and I think it's something we need to delve into, but it is simply a disruption. And we will get through this pandemic. As Her Majesty said, we will meet again. But there'll be another disruption. What's the next disruption? And people say the next pandemic. And okay, you're fair enough. Let's talk about that. But the next disruption could be that Cascadia earthquake being realized. The next one could be, we could have another 2008 financial collapse. That is an emergency for most people and a disaster for a lot of family plans and life outcomes, right? That caused significant lifelong damage to an incredible number of families, and their future lives and their plans were destroyed by the actions totally exogenous to their existence by somebody else. So we have to keep the pandemic in the frame of right now, let's do what we need to do, but serve as an example that this is but one disruption of many that are coming. So what did we learn from this disruption at the individual level, like you and I? But I think more importantly, we need to talk about lessons learned and good and bad moves that were taken at our strategic level, which have so much more orders of magnitude influence.
And I think when you mentioned the individual level, you touch on a big misconception that you brought forth to me, which I didn't know about, which is that the emergency preparedness policies, they do come from government in many ways, but they're not for government only. They're usually, as all public policy is, which is what the point you made earlier, as all public policy is, it's a way to change behavior from people at an individual level. It's for people to get better ready. Could you speak a bit more about that?
Well, exactly. I mean, the goal of any public policy is to amend, governments intervene in lives to amend behavior, because they need to encourage either more of a behavior or less of a behavior. And if we believe that people are rational individuals in neoclassical economic terms, and that they make when they have the best information, they make the best choices for themselves and they choose the best possible outcome based upon the information they have at the time. If you think people are rational and they do that, then government policy has to be, and is currently around encouraging people to take on a more preparedness behavior. And the best example of this is The Get Prepared program out of Public Safety Canada that launched in 2003, and the Ready.gov program that was launched by FEMA. And both of them were started using something called a social marketing theory, written by a U.S., and there's a great book by a U.S. professor, Nancy Meyer Emmerich. And basically what it is that they want to encourage people in marketing to take over behavior. I want you to become a consumer. So if we take preparedness through the same lens, and I need to adapt the preparedness behavior, governments looked at how do we encourage people to adapt this behavior. And what they came up with was the ubiquitous and famous 72-hour kit, this emergency whiz thing that's going to save your life. And just, for me, as you might know, I think it's no more worthy than a doorstop, but we can talk about that. But the point being is that they introduced the idea and keep to this day selling the idea of getting a 72-hour kit, not because anybody believes the 72-hour kit is going to improve anyone's outcomes. It's because it is the first tangible step in adopting a behavior change. And we know in human beings through psychology and sociology, which a lot of the research in emergency management falls off because it's a social science. We know that when people make a behavior change, they need a tangible effect, which is why if you want to become fitter, if you want to become in better shape, then as a human being, you're going to associate that with a set of sneakers or a gym membership. There's going to be a physical, tangible item that you associate with that will enable you to adopt the behavior and increase the probability that the habit will be adopted. I mean, that's a bunch of psychological, but that's what the research says. So if we follow that theory in preparedness, the government, what they're trying to do is they're telling you to buy a 72-hour or put together a 72-hour kit, hoping that is the trigger, that physical item will be the trigger to get you to start adopting more preparedness behaviors and start thinking about preparedness in other aspects of your life. So the public policy in Ready.gov that they put out, because it's get a kit, have a plan, learn to communicate, and be informed. I mean, 4 distinct things, and it's simplistic and it's straightforward. And the Canadian example is the same way, and it's beautifully run. I mean, there are incredibly intelligent people working at FEMA and Public Safety Canada. Actually, a good friend of mine runs the emergency preparedness program for Public Safety Canada, and they spend the majority of their time in Ottawa, in Canada's capital, looking at nomenclature, looking at the definition of words, looking at how we communicate to people, because words matter. The choice of words matter. And I don't think a better example exists than in Ontario when we recently went into the latest quote-unquote lockdown. And we can discuss that later if you want to, whether this is actually a lockdown or not. But the words chosen in a marketing theory by the premier were a stay-at-home order. Now, when you actually go in and read the legislative authority under all the acts in Ontario, there's no such thing as a stay-at-home order. But the words are taken and utilized because they're very meaningful. They come with a tangible effect. Here's my house. And as the premier said, if you can't decide whether this is a good idea to leave your house for, you already have your decision, right? It's not a good idea. So the whole idea of preparedness messaging from the government has been, we need to move people along this along this line of preparedness more towards adopting this behavior. And without to be a bit of a cynic, but being a realist as well, we have to understand that the government simply can't come to help. I mean, when you look at the capacity and capability of municipal, provincial, and federal governments in Canada, and you look at the ratio between police officers and citizens in a city, even in a major significant effort, there is absolutely no way that even within the first week you're likely to see anybody from an emergency measures organization coming to assist you. So it's in the government's best interest to have a better prepared population, because when you do, those are one less group of people that you have to immediately try to address their needs, because they've already taken care of their needs. Because when you look at what governments have to do, governments are responsible for critical infrastructure. Those pillars that hold up our society, that keep everything running, like water, sewer, power, all of these important things. communication. The government wants to be focused on putting that back in order. The government doesn't want to be focused on running around with fire trucks and ambulances trying to rescue people, that type of thing.
So do you think there's an issue with messaging and communications? Do you think that's at the heart of the issue, or do you think it's mixed messaging?
Oh, I think there's a huge problem with messaging. And I have to preface my comments again saying a lot of good friends of mine work in emergency management communications, and they are trying their darndest and they're doing their best. But we have a plethora of what I like to refer to as a dog's breakfast worth of messaging that is out there in the public sphere about this pandemic specifically, and the responsibilities that we're asking people to do. I mean, when you start introducing color-coded zones and you start introducing tier zones, but not all provinces and not all municipalities are using the same lingo. So now, as an individual living in say, Quebec, you've got to not only negotiate what your mayor is saying, you've also got to negotiate what your premier is saying. And then you've got to somehow layer on top of that what the federal government is saying. So traditionally in a disaster, the communications will be different between the three levels of government because they're talking about different things. And that's perfectly fine. The problem is when the messaging changes and the messaging is not consistent. And we're not telling, different levels of government are either telling you to do different things, or a singular level of government is changing what it's telling you, right? And in communications geek speak, it's message acceptance and message accommodation and adoption are not successful in cases where you have a mixed number of messages out there. And I love the Swedes. The Swedes are one of my favorite countries to study when it comes to emergency management, because they sent a booklet out to every household, and it says in case of disaster or war. And that was the title of it. And it was a punch up front in your face, and you can download this thing off the internet. And it basically said the government isn't coming to help you. We can't help you in a major disaster. We don't have enough resources. You are absolutely utter on your own. And therefore, because you're on your own, here are the things that we think you should probably do. But those communications are not what we're putting forward today. We're putting forward a much more nuanced, a much less direct. And I think if we were far more simplistic, but far more direct with people. I mean, Canada has a very compliant population compared to our friends to the south. Let's just put it that way. You know, we have a trust in our public institutions writ large. When our public health agencies speak, we listen because we believe them. We believe that they have our best interests at heart, and we believe that they're giving us the best possible advice. Not all populations in the world are like that, but in Canada, we're a compliant population. But when you have confusion and issues related to that, now you have a problem where Canada has trust in the institutions, but the institutions themselves are telling us different things. And now we have a mixed messaging. So now what you're asking your recipient to do is to attempt to decipher the messages. And when you transfer the responsibility for deciphering information and messaging to the user, what do? See you later. Bye-bye. And when we have 500 different sources on Twitter and 200 different sources on the internet, I'm giving you 5 minutes to make sense, or I'm never paying attention to you before. It's a long-standing issue in emergency crisis communication. So the piece of communication that exists right in the recovery phase, when we have an onset of an event, you have 10 minutes to be relevant. If you're not relevant in 10 minutes, you've lost. And it doesn't matter who you are. You could be the government of Canada. And if you're not relevant in 10 minutes after the event, people are elsewhere looking for information, and they're not coming back to you. So we need to be far more direct and far more simple in the messaging to people. Like the UK had a great line for a little while. It said, "Don't kill Granny." I mean, how more simple can you be? And it was directed at the youth who just probably weren't going to get that sick. But the message was, if you go out, you'll kill your grandmother. Don't kill Granny. Incredibly effective, wonderful messaging. Here we have considerations are being thought about moving from tier 3 to tier 4 in certain areas, which will see reduction of 50% to 25% capacity in big box stores. And when I'm sitting here in my living room, that means nothing to me. And I've tuned out. So I think that's a big problem in our communications. But again, we've got wonderful people trying out there.
For sure. But with so many great examples, why do you think we have such an issue with finding simple, effective messaging?
Well, it's because we have politics. I mean, let's be frank. Politics are never going away. Politics never get buried, even in an emergency. And whenever you see briefings on the state of affairs in a province, the state of affairs in a city, or the state of affairs in the country, who's giving the briefing? It's a politician. But next to them on the table may be their public health agency representative at the provincial, municipal, or at the federal level. But it's a politician giving them. And when you have politicians have to look like they're doing an exceptional job or a very good job in managing the crisis. So that is a lens or a filter through which their communications will flow. Now, the former Nova Scotia Premier, I think McNeil is still the Nova Scotia Premier. He just told people to stay the blazes home, and people printed that phrase on T-shirts. You could buy the T-shirt, "Stay the blazes home." I mean, it was great. The Manitoba, Brian Pallister, the Manitoba Premier, came out and he said, "I'm going to be unpopular and you may not like me, but this is what you have to do." So we see the rare direct messaging from some politicians, but the majority of messaging that we get from the political agents that we have in the conversation are those filtered, politically orientated statements about what's going on. When we see the public health people, that filter is off. Right? So that filter is, these are the caseloads, this is the number of deaths, this is the advice that we give, this is why we think it's a good idea to do that. That's the kind of direct things that need to be amplified by the politician, not filtered by the politician. I think that's one of the primary reasons why we have a mixed communications situation.
But you mentioned the UK and Sweden. They also have politicians delivering those messages, no?
Well, they do, but they're far more blunt. Now, Boris Johnson in the UK has gotten into a little bit of trouble over other than the fact that he had COVID-19 on his own, is that, he's made some pretty dumb statements, pretty blunt statements like, "We're ahead of this, we've got this," etc. But he's now turned a corner, and I think the experience himself with COVID-19 helped with that, and he's more blunt and he's more straightforward to the point. Like a prime example is, if we just look at the example of our prime minister, we've got the recent reporting that Pfizer vaccine, for decisions as a company on their own, have reduced the shipments to Canada by 50% for a period of time. Any logical person can understand that is going to have significant and immediate impacts on Canada's ability to vaccinate. That's not an opposition perspective. That's what normal, rational human beings will hear. We don't hear that from the political messaging. We hear that plans are in place and mitigation, we'll deal with this, we'll utilize other things. See, so we get the message brought out that the reduction is happening, but don't worry, it's under our control, we've got it, everything's going to be okay messaging, instead of, yes, this will cause a problem, and this is how I'm going to address the problem. Those are two distinctively different ways of handling a communication message. And my argument has always been that people are far more receptive of those direct, truthful, in-your-face, difficult to accept but necessary statements by their leaders than they are the fuzzy, feel-good, don't worry, I got this, we're all in this together, let's just give each other a big hug type of messaging that comes out. And research...
Via messaging.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is just not me. This is what research tells us, that's what people respond better to in the immediacy of the event. That this is what you're facing, this is what I need you to do.
That's why in times of crisis, especially in the United States, people turn to what we call populist leaders, or even in general just don't like to vote for centrist or neoliberal or neoconservative candidates. They usually try to go for more, I guess you could say, honestly ideological candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why our current Premier of Ontario has been seen to be doing such a good job, because he is arguably one of the best definite presentations of a populist around. As the people started looking for something more in a certain area, he did more in that area. Like he following popular sentiment and popular desire by doing the things like you can't listen to communications publicly without understanding that people are just absolutely annoyed the fact you can go to big box stores, but in Costco, Walmart, but the little guy has to shut down his stores. So what does the populist premier do in his latest quote unquote lockdown? Is he reduced the capacity of big box stores to 25%, but left grocery stores at 50%. Now, you have to weigh in the details of the announcement and the PDF attached documents, blah, 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 to find all those information out. But when you look in there, you see that he is hitting on all of the things that the popular sentiment says we're upset about, he's intervening on. And he's giving that message. And his message was blunt. He will shut them down. He will come down on them hard if they violate what he's decided is the appropriate level of occupation in the town. So that's a good example of a populist telling people not only what they need to hear, but also what they want to hear.
And have you noticed any other good examples of leaders, whether in Canada or elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give credit to our Prime Minister in the first part of this pandemic. Now, all politics aside, when we hit this pandemic in February and, well, December, if you look at reality, but when the federal government publicly acknowledged that we were in the middle of a pandemic in March, the messaging coming out of the federal government was excellent. The messaging coming from the Prime Minister, daily updates, what we were doing, because it was a voice in the chaos. Because one of the leader's responsibilities is to put calm into chaos. So as you have all the horses running around, somebody has to walk calmly through them to calm down the horses. And because of that, we had a leader. Now, things gone off the rail on all levels of government since then, and there's no one who can escape criticism for communications. But I think the best example in our country is our Prime Minister at the beginning of this pandemic was an exceptional communicator. Because like you said, in times of high crisis, people look to their chosen leader for direction. People look, I don't know what to do. What am I supposed to do? And they look to their leader. And again, that's that 10-minute, you have 10 minutes to be relevant in an emergency on social media. He had a very short period of time to be relevant in the discussion nationally, and he became relevant. So, I don't care what anybody's political leaning is, the man did an exceptional job in the first part.
Do you think that's why the United States has had such a difficult response to COVID and such a disastrous effort to confront it, because they've had little to no leadership?
The difficulty with the United States of America is their leadership, and this is not just the current president. This goes back many presidents. I would argue to the second half of the second term of Bill Clinton, America has been polarized and cut in two, and a few haphazard independent people running around in the middle. So it didn't matter what the leader said. Most were going to believe he was the great Satan, and most were going to believe he was the great savior. And that's the problem with American politics and intervention. The only time that I've seen the Americans come together is whenever missiles are flying. So when missiles are flying, they're great, they're wonderful. The commander-in-chief is doing what they need to do to defend our nation, and everybody rallies behind the commander-in-chief. That's American culture. But when you look at the pandemic response in America, it's very much polarized around an administration where one half of the country was desperately trying to find everything wrong with what the administration was doing, and the other half of the country was spent trying to find everything wrong with what the other half was trying to find wrong. So this was the cultural that they were in. So I'm not going to say that one leader could have done better. I'm sure messaging could have been clearer, but the reception of the messaging, 40% of the people in America were not going to listen to what the administration said, irrespective of what they said. Like, it just wasn't going to be accepted. But that's United States as a separate and distinct nation that has a far more difficult problem with division within the country, and the pandemic just exposed it more. Is really what is all it did.
And what do you think it is about Canada's political culture that makes it that our response and dealing with the pandemic hasn't been as great as other Western nations?
Because we, as a country, believe in a phrase that our famous or infamous former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau said, attack the policy, not the man. And the idea was here in Canada, we, like I said before, we trust our professional institutions. And on a political idea here in this country, we, for the most part, and it's been changing a bit lately, but for the most part, we attack the policy. We debate policy. We don't say that one party leader is a pariah and a horrible human being and should never be given power, except the extremes that are on both sides of the spectrum. For the vast majority of Canadians, we debate policies and actions and choices that we can implement within our country, and we vote according to how we see the ship steering. But for the most part, our politics are a slight rudder change. If it's like a 10 or 15 degree change on our rudder in Canada. It's not a 30 or 45 degree change like we have in the US. They're so diametrically opposed in their lens and their framework for the country that as they change the White House, they're like a sailboat tacking into the wind. That's how American politics looks. The Canadians are just like a motorboat that just slightly changes. We just move a little bit left, we move a little bit right, but pretty much we're a centrist country. So Canadians, we debate policy, we debate parties, we don't attack individuals, and we don't espouse hatred for our leaders, irrespective of whether you agree with them or not. So if the current Prime Minister wins the next election, he is everybody's Prime Minister in Canada, whether you voted for him or not. But if you ask 45% of the U.S., the last individual or current soon-to-be-gone individual was not their president, and they did not recognize him as their president. So that's a very different of how they look at it.
Because unlike the U.S., the Prime Minister doesn't spend his entire mandate just reversing the policies that the previous Prime Minister just enacted. It's usually they're kept in place and tweaked, and they're usually built upon, rather.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's like no matter where you are on the political spectrum, in Canada, for example, the funding of the Public Health Agency of Canada was created out of the SARS epidemic that happened in Toronto. We had a lot, I think it was 68 or 86, I get the number backwards, of people that died in 2003. And then we brought in the Public Health Agency of Canada, which didn't exist before then. We didn't have an overarching governance body that managed from a strategic federal level public health issues, be it pandemics, be it waterborne illnesses, be it, we had nobody federally other than the Department of Health talking to the WHO and other countries. So we adopted this governance framework in Canada. Now, the party that brings it in, the other party is always going to argue with it because that's their job to be in opposition. But this was pan agreement. Everybody agreed that this had to come in, and this had to have the mandate, and this had to have the funding that it was required. So most of our politicians don't like to agree, but pretty much every policy passed in Canada has unanimous support. Just nobody wants to be able to say that, because if you do, you just keep re-electing the same guy. So when we increase child tax benefits, when we reduce taxes on individuals, and everybody loves that. But of course, they can't all agree with it politically, because then how do you have a political debate? So you're absolutely right. When we look from a pandemic perspective, when we built that framework as a result of SARS, both nationally and at the provincial levels, to deal with pandemics, to set up, to get ready for the next one. Nobody knew that it would be, within 2 decades we would see the next major one come through, but that we set up that governance, and that was a cross-party full support. Nobody stood at a microphone and championed shutting down the Public Health Agency of Canada. We trust our institutions.
And you mentioned the SARS epidemic and the creation of the Public Health Agency of Canada. Do you think that's when the government of Canada, the federal government at least, started to care about emergency preparedness, or do you think it goes back, or do you think it started a bit earlier?
Oh, it started much earlier. I mean, emergency preparedness in Canada came out of the Cold War. It started in the civil defense era, where we used to organize Right back in about 1940 is when we first started seeing on the West Coast. We had people from civil defense in the UK come over to give us ideas of how to build gun emplacements on the western side of Vancouver Island, because we were afraid that the Japanese Navy would sail through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to attack the city of Vancouver. So we built a whole bunch of emplacements. And then we had the Cold War come in, where we had the risk of nuclear bombers coming from Russia. And that was great because we had 6 hours notice. So we could evacuate cities. We could do all these things. So you had these huge civil defense organizations, separate, but looking awfully and structured awfully like the military within towns, city, provinces in Canada, to deal with managing the population in the case of a nuclear attack, because you'd get 6 hours notice. Then we had ICBMs brought in, and that just changed the whole game, because now you get 30 minutes notice. Forget it. We're not going to be able to do much other than the messaging at that point switched completely to build a bunker. So the whole civil defense messaging from the government of Canada from the 1960s forward was all about building a bunker in your basement with the necessary supplies to be there for 2 weeks. And the reason for 2 weeks was not because that's when the government would come help you, because in a nuclear attack there's no government left, but because that's when the radiation levels of the fallout are low enough that you're able to start venturing outside your house. So that's where the messaging started, and then it evolved through the Cold War. And it really wasn't until we saw, I believe it was 1987 or 1988, when we had the Ethiopian famine, and it was the first international disaster that was shown on nightly newscasts that didn't involve war. And like Vietnam War was on there, that's fair enough, but it was the first true disaster and human suffering outside of Canada that was shown on the TVs of Canada. And that changed an existence where, across the other side of the world, hundreds of millions of people were at risk of starving to death, and I just threw out half the supper nobody wanted. So the messaging started coming in about emergency preparedness at that time. It started, and then we started having conversations about major incidents that happened around the world. And you could see this is where internationally we see disaster and emergency management kind of merge with climate change and the effects of climate change. And, the 2004 earthquake off Indonesia, Banda Aceh, that caused tsunamis across the whole Indian Ocean that killed, we think 250,000 people, but likely a lot more. I mean, that started the Hyogo framework of all of the countries getting together the following year in 2005 and putting together the Hyogo framework, which was the agreement on bringing back together, creating this thing called disaster risk reduction, where all the countries would get together and share ideas and efforts on reducing their risk to major known naturally occurring events, so that we would see less of this happening again. I mean, that evolved in 2015 to the Sendai framework, which was the next agreement that takes us to 2030. And it's all about the international cooperation on disaster risk reduction. So as you started to see this start coming into the forefront, and we start seeing it more and more on our TV screens, it's undeniable that the frequency and the severity of natural disasters are exponentially growing as a result of climate change. And therefore, we have more and more Canadians being impacted, and therefore more and more calls on the government for support. Therefore, more of an impetus for the government to reach out in a preparedness message to get people prepared, because there's more and more effects happening to the individual Canadian.
In terms of policies, I guess since then, have you seen a lot of changes, or have you mostly seen just a progression?
Oh, there's been some great changes in Canada. I mean, we have to laud and give credit where credit is due. Canada has an exceptional framework between the provinces and the federal government on federal provincial agreements on emergency management. There's the FERP, as we call it, the Federal Emergency Response Plan. There's the National Emergency Response Program. There's the National Emergency Stockpile of Equipment, which unfortunately had a bit of a problem with it when it came to the pandemic. But we have all these FPTs, we call them, Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Agreements, across constitutional barriers, because responsibilities in our country are based upon what's written in the Constitution as to which level of government is responsible, and then a whole bunch of new things that have come out since that Constitution was repatriated that weren't in the original Constitution are now considered shared responsibility. Like, we never really talked about the environment in 1982 when we repatriated the Constitution. So now both levels of government. So how do those levels of government relate and deal with each other? Canada has actually a pretty exceptional framework. Now, I'll be frank, politics gets in the mess of that all the time, right? Because different politicians, and it doesn't matter whether from a federal perspective, whether it's been a liberal prime minister or a conservative prime minister, they have either stepped all over the provincial jurisdiction or totally avoided the federal jurisdiction, or both at the same time. So while the agreements are well in place and the professional layer that sits just below the political layer is exceptionally well coordinated and things flow extremely well, when a province asks for federal help, it comes very quickly. And it's a very well-defined process how we do that. A friend of mine, and my student mentor, as I call him, he wrote his 2018 PhD dissertation on the use of the Canadian Armed Forces in domestic emergency response. So he wrote it on the governance and how we integrate federal provincial governance when we deploy a federal capability into a provincial disaster. And it's well done. Like, we don't have a mess up. We don't have fights on TV between army officers and emergency managers on who's in charge. And we have an exceptional system within our country. You look at FEMA. FEMA has cut the United States of America into 10 regions. And each region is built based upon the needs of that region. So FEMA has those, their country's much bigger and much greater population. But they have FEMA, though, is the difference between America and the U.S., just to note, is that FEMA is a far more response-orientated organization. Their structure and governance, they have offices of response, offices of recovery. So FEMA very much is at the forefront of being involved immediately from a policy perspective of being prepared for, and an execution phase of involving immediately in disaster response. The Canadian federal government, under legislation, has no authority to intervene unless they're asked. From a legislative point of view, the federal government of Canada cannot send the military in to help unless the province asks for it. It's just not allowed. It's against the law. Now, I don't think we'd ever get a political governance collapse in a province where we would ever be in that situation, but that's how the framework exists. So that there's a great cooperation, a great set of affairs. People generally in emergency management stay out of each other's sandbox far more than they do otherwise.
And do you think that's the future where the CAF, the Canadian Armed Forces, are headed? Because it seems to be one of the only issue areas where the CAF can actually do a lot of good, and where there isn't much, overseas combat presence anymore. It's mostly peacekeeping operations and support to NATO and UN operations. And on the home front, it seems to be that they're mostly used for disaster relief. Do you think that's what's going to continue to happen?
It probably likely is going to continue to happen, and it was brought up by the now former Chief of Defense Staff, General Vance, whom I had the chance to work for on his strategic staff. And he raised the alarm bells, because this is, the Canadian Armed Forces is literally the only capability the federal government has to bring to bear. The RCMP don't have a huge surge capacity. Transport Canada, Coast Guard, none of them have surge capacities to help the provinces. The really only physical resource and manpower is the Canadian Armed Forces. And if you look at General Vance's response to the pandemic, as soon as the pandemic hit, he knew, and rightfully so, that the Canadian Armed Forces were going to have to likely get involved in some part. The first thing that he did is he put a ring around Canada's combat power. He took all of our strength and our regular force combat units that are training and prepared to conduct combat operations, and he didn't use them in the pandemic response, and intentionally so, because when we looked at the geopolitical world, you could see that nobody knew whether whether the pandemic itself would be the straw that broke the camel's back, there are a lot of governments around the world that are, barely hanging on to governing their countries, and the pandemic can push them over the edge. So geopolitically, the world was looking at a potential significant disruption event as a result of this pandemic. So the Canadian government put a wall around the combat power of the Canadian Armed Forces to ensure it was preserved should it be necessary by the federal government to be used to help other situations that may occur. So it was the reserve capability of the Canadian Armed Forces, the reserve medical capability, the reserve units that were called up. And basically what the military did was the military said, any reservist that wants a full-time job can have it right now. Sign up, no questions asked. We'll give you the full-time, because there's a slight differential between reserve and full-time pay. We'll give you the differential. We'll give you a full contract with benefits, and brought the reserve capability in to deal locally, which is largely what the reserves are positioned for. It's not what they're designed for. It's what they're positioned for, because they exist in each and every little community around the country. The Army alone has over 125 reserve units across the country. But it has 3 fighting brigades. That's it. So the 3 fighting brigades, you put a lock on those and you keep them at home, because everybody was ordered to stay home and isolate so that they would not become infected with COVID-19. So because should they be required, they would be called out. So Canada utilized its reserve capability for this. But the problem that we have is that the more and more you use the Canadian Armed Forces for domestic response, the less and less they're available for international response. And to train Canadian forces up to that sharpening the spear and sharpening the knife till they're absolutely ready to be embedded into international operations is a very well managed and staged affair. There's about a year process to take a Canadian Armed Forces unit to get it ready to, say, go to Latvia, where our forward battalion is right now.
Right.
So you can't take them out of that training and send them to a wildfire and then return them to that training and still meet the timeline. So the more and more you draw on the Canadian Armed Forces for domestic emergency response, the less and less capable the Canadian Armed Forces be for their primary mission. Now, the mission of the military is always mastered by the civilian masters and the political foe, but General Vance's idea, and that he's putting forward, is every time you ask for help, we will be there, because that's why we exist, to help Canadians. But knowing that every time you do that, you're taking away a little bit of the capability for the Canadian military to meet these other things that you've asked us to do. So that is the danger we have in Canada, because we don't train and equip our forces for disaster response. Now, if we want to, that's an absolute choice we can make. There are great roads to go down to start equipping part of the Canadian Armed Forces to do that. But it's like any choice, it's opportunity cost, right? As soon as we start doing that with the Canadian Armed Forces, then the question you have to have is, okay, what are we not going to do now that we were doing before?
And General Vance was right, because a lot of countries, if you look at the Eurasian region, if you look at the Belarus, Ukraine, even Russia, and if you look at the Middle Eastern region, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, those governments completely collapsed as a result of the pandemic. Not that there were any problems before, but the pandemic was surely an acceleration to those problems. Well, so it was good that we kept our ground forces there in case. Well, you mentioned Latvia. I think we just made the switch because some of the members of the brigade there were affected with COVID, so they had to. I think we have 550 troops in Latvia right now.
Yeah, there's
so
5.
They had to bring some home and then bring some back there as well.
Well, they just, as a side note, they just conducted an exchange, because that's a 6-month deployment. So they're in the process. They're just finishing up now the exchange. Actually, my son's in the Army, and it's his infantry battalion. He's not going, but his infantry battalion that is headed to Latvia. So they're just in the process of finishing that out every 6 months. But again, when you're in when you have 550 Canadians deployed in Latvia, getting ready to potentially go toe-to-toe with the Russian army should it cross the border, you have to keep them isolated in a country for which Canada does not control the internal policies. Right? That's we have troops in Ukraine as well, and they were delayed that mission was put on hold for a little while in the beginning of the pandemic because the Ukrainian government was all over the map in their response to the pandemic, and therefore it was difficult for that. We also have the troops deployed in northern Iraq and in Kuwait as part of the mission against ISIS or Daesh. So yeah, and the difficulty with that is always those geopolitical events. What happens when governments do collapse as a result of the strain of the pandemic? I mean, the biggest issue in, I think, geopolitically is Africa. But so far, Africa has been either underreported, let's be frank, or it has somehow escaped large effects. And it may be weather related, it may be transmission related, who knows. But I would argue, and I think you would agree, that most of the governments in Africa are precarious at best. In good times.
That's right. A lot of them were simply broke down as a result of the pandemic, similar to the governments we just mentioned in Eurasia and the Middle East. But then it was already so much worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so when you look at, from a Canadian perspective, you look at the issue of the military trying to help where they can, because the military is always the mission of, is always what we call the force of last resort. There's nobody after them. Like literally, when you call in the military from a provincial government to assist with the situation, there is nobody else you can call. It's it. That's the force of last resort. Short of a UN task force coming into your country, that's all there exists. So because of that, the military is very hesitant to volunteer. I mean, they'll always respond. You know, sending an infantry battalion of soldiers to northern Saskatchewan to help deal with a fire, to deal with a wildland fire, you know what? That's a short-term fix, but that raises a whole bunch of long-term structural questions about whether that's the right response or is a greater investment in an emergency management capability separate and distinct from the military within Canada is a better outcome than simply saying, hey, don't worry, if all things go pear-shaped or they go south, we can just pick up the phone. We'll get a couple of battalions of free labor. They'll dig a whole bunch of fire breaks and everybody will be happy.
And where would you put your weight in that debate?
Oh, the debate has to be at the provincial level. I mean, that's where the resources have to be. The provinces, like we go back to our earlier discussion on HIRAS, you know, the hazard index, our identification and risk assessment. Each province faces a different set of risk, and that province has to be capable of dealing with that risk within its own resources. So the problem that we have is that the way to get a little off on a tangent, the way our taxation structure in this country is built, the only real money lies at the federal level. So because of that, provinces have to figure out not only these technical agreements that they have to figure out how to fund preparedness at the provincial level. You know, how do we have to be doing more than simply saying, buy a 72-hour kit. We're going to come help you after 72 hours. Just survive. And let's be frank, you can drink puddle water. You don't need to eat for 3 days. And none of us have frozen to death pretty much anywhere in Canada over the winter. So, you know, you don't need anything. You'll be fine. You can survive 72 hours. The point being is that we need to invest in preparedness so that when an event is realized, the responsibilities of our governments are far less. But again, that's both investment in mitigation and preparedness. But it's a difficult conversation to have because you're in competition with all the other requirements and all the other wants in society. I mean, when I try to put forward an idea that we need to invest more in preparedness communications, and I'm going up against free childcare, I have a problem. Both of them are exceptionally necessary. We can't afford everything. Free childcare is probably going to win the day. So if you look at what actually, and I think this is a point to hit, what actually works in emergency preparedness. So when we look at the literature and we look at about 55 years of study, how long we've been studying emergency preparedness, we know that there are a couple of things that actually work, that investments by government agencies actually have better outcomes. They've been measured and found to be true. And the number one is communities. right? When I grew up younger, now I'm a bit older than you, but when I grew up younger, I knew all my neighbors. I knew who they were. Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, Mr. Miss whatever. I knew them. I knew what they do. I knew their ages. I saw them in the neighborhood so I can see if they had physical limitations. We had a sense of community within our neighborhoods. We looked out for each other. That was an active part of who we were and identified as. And you can go right into anthropological science of humans having a maximum capacity of about 150 relationships or so. But now when you look at streets, I live in a townhouse in Ottawa. There's about 200 townhouses on my street. I know maybe 5 families. I don't know my neighbors. I don't know that 5 doors down from me there is an elderly lady that lives alone whose family is from out of town, and therefore in some type of disruption she was likely to need help, but I don't know how to reach out to her. I don't know that I should have to go talk to her to make sure she's okay. Right? We don't have that sense of community anymore. So when you look at the research that's been done in the past where governments have invested directly in community programs and building communities up and building these social bonds, it's called social capital. It's half of my theoretical framework for my dissertation. It's all about building those bonds between people. And we see in research that not only do communities fare better in the disaster, their recovery is far better if they started off pre-disaster as having a strong sense of community. We also see this in faith organizations, right? If you're a member of a church, whatever your denomination may be, you know those people. You care about those people, and those people matter, and you will reach out to help those people without a doubt in the times of an emergency. That's the kind of social bond. So as an emergency preparedness guy, everybody thinks I want to build a fire station. No, I want to build a community center with programming to have people getting together. I want our societies getting together at the small micro community level every weekend to have a weekend block party. That's where, I get a lot of long, strange looks in the emergency preparedness world when I talk about investing in communities and community programs. Free swimming lessons builds emergency preparedness far better than having a flashlight in your house. The evidence shows us that clearly. And the reason I slam on the 72-hour kits all the time is that there was a study in 2016 done in the United States where they looked at the top 71 organizations across the country and looked at their content list. And only one thing was common, and that was water. And far down the list, second, was food. So if we talk about the top organizations across North America can't even get their lists right. But what we do know is we have zero evidence, and I mean actual tested academic evidence, that anyone's outcomes were improved during a disaster by having one of these 72-hour kits. Now, logically, having canned food and a flashlight and a radio, logically we can all say sure. But we like to work on evidence, something that we know that works. So right now what we have is a government who's investing hundreds of millions of dollars in an education program to tell people to purchase something that we have absolutely zero evidence that it works. And oh, by the way, less than 50% of the people are listening to you. So seriously, that's the state of our emergency preparedness communications coming out of government. So this is why I consider myself a bit of a statistical outlier where I say, fair enough, talk about 72-hour kits, but we need to go back to what works, and that is building that social capital. Because traditionally, when I say first responders to people, everybody thinks police, fire, and EMS, but not at all. When you look at statistics that come out of disasters, natural disasters and man-made disasters throughout the body of work that exists out there, first responders are not police, fire, and EMS. They're your neighbor. They're your community member. They're the human being who happens to be standing back to you. Far, far more people are rescued from collapsed structures by the neighbors than are ever done by the firefighters in the urban search and rescue. Now, they get the TV hits. Don't get me wrong, these people do fabulous jobs. But when you look at the actual number of people saved in a disaster, it's not the traditional first responders. It's the people. So when you invest in the people at the community level, when you invest in training people, there's a great program out of the United States called Cert, Community Emergency Response Training. And what it is it provides the training to people in neighborhoods to be able to evaluate building structures as to whether they're ready for collapse or habitable or not. Right now, we just wait for the engineer, that wonderful city engineer that's going to come around and check every building in a city of 1 million people. No, we actually train citizens to do that. We train citizens to mark the doors with the X's and color-coded that they've been searched for people after collapse. Like, this is being done in communities around the world. And that kind of investment is what bears fruit in preparedness, not a 72-hour kit. Because that's all you ever hear about, right? Oh, and right. Don't get me wrong. Right now, we also have to go out and follow the pandemic preparedness things, which are excellent things. But again, this is what gets a lot of us on the who stay in our little niches of emergency preparedness, get our backs up when we keep hearing this repetitive message that isn't being listened to, but it doesn't actually follow the evidence that we know is true. And if we could take that $100 million away from the current plan and put towards this training program, training people free of charge on your street in emergency first aid. Wouldn't that be great? That's far better than telling people to buy a first aid kit. Like, seriously, how many people go around and take on their own, take first aid training from St. John Ambulance or or the Canadian Red Cross? A few people interested will do. All these other people the ones who are listening are going to get all these first aid kits from Shoppers Drug Mart or Jean Coutu, and they're putting them on their counter. They have no idea what to do with them, but they've got a first aid kit and they've got a check in the box, right?
That's right.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, that's the part that we're saying, is that there is a roadmap to not dramatically, but methodically increase emergency preparedness within the Canadian population, that is laid out, that is evidence-based, that is supported by case studies, and we're simply not following it.
That's right. Now, you've answered all my questions, but before we sort of end the recording here, do you have anything else you'd like to add or ask, or anything you'd like to mention?
I think there's an interesting conversation that I think any of my professional colleagues out there that would be interested in, is that emergency management is having a bit of a issue with itself right now in the pandemic, in that it's an identity crisis. Because when you see the federal government sitting up at the lectern and they're all sitting at their seats spaced 6 feet apart and talking, you don't see the public safety minister. Bill Blair's not there. Emergency preparedness for Canada lies within Public Safety Canada, and you do not see Bill Blair talking at all about the pandemic. What you have is the Public Health Agency, and you have the political heads talking. But what you don't have is the emergency management organizations, and you won't see it at the provincial level, and you certainly won't see it at the municipal level, where your emergency management offices, who are working hand over fist because they own the business continuity plan, they own the disruption plan, they write and measure and exercise the programs to get the governments ready to operate in disruptions. That's a function of emergency management. But as soon as you have a significant disruption like a pandemic, the front facing of the government does not have any emergency management professionals in it. So there is a below the the level of conversation, there is a huge debate going on within the emergency management profession as it emerges as a profession, as to how do we carve our piece, because a lot of the work in the background is being done to keep the government functioning by the emergency management professionals, but they have no forward facing. And the difficulty is, it's not a bunch of people looking for credit. They're not looking for a pat on the back. But they're also going to be the ones who are asking for funding. And who do you think is, when the calls for funding come at the end of this pandemic? The Public Health Agency of Canada is going to get a miraculously large revamp funding. You can see that coming like a train, right? They're going to get everything they want and the kitchen sink with it, without a problem. Emergency management organizations are going to have a difficult time because they're not in the front facing. They're not being seen. They're doing the work behind. And I have a lot of friends who have not had a full night's sleep in a lot of months, and they run city emergency management offices, but they're absolutely silent. You don't hear anything public from them. And as well, my friend that works in the federal side of emergency management, I mean, our discussions are all about, they're just trying to keep the federal government running. I mean, let's be frank, they're just trying to keep the federal government going. The federal government below, one step down from the politicians, there's part of them that are trying to get the vaccine out, etc. But the rest of them are simply trying to keep the federal government running in disrupted operations, etc. And they're not, and this is all the emergency management stuff that happens in the background. So it's a difficult time for the emergency management as a field, as a profession, as it emerges and starts to get because it comes to its forefront when we have earthquakes and disasters and forest fires and hurricanes and things like that. You always see the emergency management professionals at the lectern. You don't right now. I'm hoping that they find a way to come forward and come through that, but it's going to be a bit of a difficult time for that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, that concludes all my questions. Thank you so much for coming. Anything else you'd like to mention, or?
No, I mean, if the message for anybody that's listening is part of join the conversation. I mean, we need to build this conversation on emergency preparedness. We need to step outside what every single person talks about and start moving towards what we know works. And if nothing else, if somebody wants to ask the question, what do I need to do to become better prepared? My first answer is go meet your neighbor. Knowing your neighbor and therefore having access to them and their resources is far better off than going to the store and purchasing any item, by far. I mean, if you want to become more prepared, go meet your neighbors, get to know your neighbors. Have a barbecue in your backyard that's 5 people or less for the province of Ontario. Stay 6 feet apart. But in times like this, when we're being told to stay away from our neighbors, is the very time we need to be meeting our neighbors, is the time we need to be building that social capital and coming together as a community. So when we have a 3-day power outage, we feel okay to go knock on our neighbor's door and say, hi, my name is so-and-so. We met at a barbecue. Is everything okay here? Is there anything I can do for you? And that's how you build resilience, far better than anything you can buy in a store.
Simple and effective. I like it.
Yep. We need more of that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. That's a wrap.
Okay, perfect.
This concludes today's episode of Realpolitik, where I discussed the pandemic and emergency preparedness in Canada with expert and scholar Jeff Donaldson. It was a pleasure having him on, and I thank him for his time, patience, and service. Feel free to debate the ideas put forward in these episodes by submitting a comment, counter video, or by emailing us at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com. Please check out our Patreon if you would like to support us as well. Thank you, and take care.